In this lesson, we'll learn about the tools available to us for perspective drawing right inside Illustrator. Okay, so Illustrator CS5 actually includes some fantastic new tools for perspective drawing right inside of Illustrator. Now, if you know anything about perspective drawing, you know that there's really three main components to any perspective drawing. We have a horizon line, we have at least one vanishing point, and we have perspective lines coming from our vanishing point to the objects that we're drawing. Now, Illustrator is going to translate that just a little bit differently, but those essential items are still intact. Now, Illustrator is going to actually give us a perspective grid to work from. Now, let me go ahead and show you how to turn on the perspective grid for our document. I'm working on a standard 8.5 by 11 document oriented with a landscape format here, so I'm just going to come up to View and choose Perspective Grid right here. And this very first option is to show the grid. Now notice there's a keyboard shortcut for that, Shift-Control-I, and I actually use that keyboard shortcut quite a bit just to hide my grid if I ever feel like it's getting in the way. Now, in looking at the grid that Illustrator's given us here, we see that we still have all the main components of a perspective drawing. We have our horizon line, we have our vanishing points, and we know this is a 2-point perspective because we have 2 vanishing points. We also have perspective lines coming up and growing out of each of the vanishing points over to this perspective grid right in the center of our artboard. Now, I tell you what, let me go ahead and hide this perspective grid here. I'm going to go ahead and use my keyboard shortcut, Control-Shift-I, and show you one other way to turn on the perspective grid here in Illustrator. We can actually choose the perspective grid tool, which is right here in your tool panel, and if we click on that, there's actually a couple tools underneath that, but notice that the keyboard shortcut is Shift-P for the perspective grid tool, and if we choose that, it's going to again turn on the perspective grid for our document here. Now, we're not going to dive into the perspective grid tool and the perspective selection tool just yet. We're going to do that in just a moment. Let's go ahead and talk about this grid some more here. Just grab my selection tool. Now, if you remember, under that view drop-down, under perspective grid, there's several options here. We actually have a separate set of rulers just for our perspective grid, and we can actually turn those on here. You can see the rulers have been applied here along the center of the grid. Now, if we come over here and go again to the perspective grid under View, you see a Snap to Grid option is on by default. That's a really helpful option when you get into drawing in perspective. We can also lock our grid so that we can't move those vanishing points around, or we can lock the station point, which means we have locked the 2 vanishing points together. So if we move one vanishing point, it's actually going to move both vanishing points. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that we're working on a 2-point perspective. We can actually come down here and change the perspective, and we can work in either a 1-point perspective, a 2-point, or a 3-point perspective. Now, we also have some options here to save our grid as a preset if we've made some changes to our perspective grid, but let's take a look at this Define Grid option here. We're actually going to get several different options here for our grid that we can customize. Now, we're not going to go through every single option here, just want to hit on a few of these. We have the name of our grid. Right now we're at custom. We could choose one of those 3 defaults that we just looked at. We have the type of grid being a 2-point perspective. We could change that here. We have the units of measure, the scale, and we have the specification for how often a grid line is drawn in. We have the viewing angle, the viewing distance, and the horizon height, and then we can customize the color and opacity for each area of our grid. So let's go ahead and close this window out. Before we do, we actually have a button here to again save this grid as a preset if we've made changes to our default grid. So let's go ahead and cancel this right now. And let's come over here to our tool panel and grab our perspective grid tool. Now, notice when we do that, we have a series of handles that appear on top of our grid that's going to allow us to customize everything about this grid here. We can change the location of our vanishing points here just by clicking and dragging those. We can change the location of our horizon line simply by clicking on this handle here and adjusting that. We have 3 handles here that all control the extent of our grid, both the vertical extent of our grid, and we can choose how far we want this grid to be drawn back. Now, I'm not zoomed in quite close enough to see the extent of this blue side of our grid, but you can see here that we can actually zoom in a little closer, and that grid is rendered all the way back to this handle right here. So let's go ahead and zoom out here. Down here at the bottom, we have a series of different plane controls. Right here in the center, we're going to have the origin of our grids. We're going to have a control right here to control the left grid plane, and you can see we can drag that around just like so and control the left grid plane. Let's go ahead and move that back where it was, and we have here a control for the right grid plane. this control right in the center is going to be for the horizontal grid, because we have another grid right here. It may be a little hard to see. It's green in color, and it's called our horizontal grid. Now, with this perspective grid tool, we can actually make modifications to the grid on our screen here. Now, we also have another tool nested underneath this tool called the perspective selection tool, and the keyboard shortcut for that is Shift V. Let's go ahead and select that now. Now, the perspective selection tool is going to actually allow us which portion of our perspective grid we're actually going to be drawing on. Now, I want to direct your attention up here to the top left corner of our work area, and we have what's called a plane switching widget. Now, we have sort of a three-dimensional cube here, and you can see here that the area around the cube is currently highlighted. Right now, we're set to no active grid, which means we're going to be just drawing on a two-dimensional surface, either on the scratch area or on the artboard for our document. Now, we can actually use this perspective selection tool to mouse over this and select a plane of our grid. Now, notice I've clicked on this left plane here, and we've selected this left grid to draw on. And likewise, we can select either of these planes here. We can select the right grid, or we can select the horizontal grid and choose that grid and draw in that particular perspective. Now, also notice the change in my cursor state as I select these different planes to draw on. Right now, we've got the horizontal plane selected, so we've got a little horizontal line with an arrow pointing down. If I select to the right grid, you're going to see a vertical line with an arrow pointing to the right. So there's a reminder there on your cursor which plane you have selected, so you don't ever forget. Now remember, if you ever want to draw not in perspective, maybe you've got your perspective grid turned on and you want to draw a flat two-dimensional object, you can simply come up here and select this no active grid option around our cube here, and we're going to select the area that is not in perspective here. So we'll be drawing flat objects. Now we can also close the perspective, the plane switching widget here by clicking the little X in the corner, but let's say for a moment that maybe we want to change the location of this widget. There's actually some other perspective grid options here. If we double click on either one of our tools here, our perspective grid tool or our perspective selection tool, we can double click on that here and bring up this perspective grid options dialog window, and you can see here we have a checkbox next to show active plane widget. Now if we turn that off there, the active plane widget is going to be disabled, and we're not going to see that. So we can also change the position of our widget here to any of the four corners of our workspace. We have a couple other options down here below that have to do with automatic plane positioning. Now, if we have some artwork here on our perspective grid, we can actually check these two options here, and then with the perspective selection tool selected, we can actually hold down Shift and click on an anchor point or an intersection of grid lines to automatically switch over to that portion of our perspective grid. Alright, so as you can see here, there's really a lot of different options and a lot of different variables for drawing elements in perspective inside Illustrator. Really, we've just scratched the surface here. So in the next lesson, we're going to continue looking at perspective, and we're going to look at both drawing objects in perspective and then moving objects we've already drawn into perspective.